A crucial business deal was finalized. I felt relieved and was chatting with the representative, John. From now on, our companies would have a long-term relationship. I truly believed that. But suddenly, the client's manager, Mike, appeared and said something shocking. "What? You're a middle school graduate? We can't deal with such an incompetent person. The contract is off." John started to panic. I was stunned, unable to comprehend what was being said. Then Mike continued to degrade me with more harsh words. "A middle school graduate must be an idiot. We can't contract with a company that employs such people. A middle school graduate is incompetent." At that moment, I grasped the situation I was in. Given how far things had gone, there was no turning back. I uttered some words and was about to leave. Then, Mike, his face turning pale, ended up begging me for forgiveness. "My name is James, and I'm 36 years old. I grew up with my father, Tom, who ran a small factory. My mother passed away from an illness when I was little, so my father raised me alone. Since he had only one employee, he didn't have time to spend with me, and I was often left alone at home. When I became a grade schooler, I started waiting for his return at his company because I felt lonely at home. He didn't say anything about it, so I often watched his work. I spent my days like this, but as I became a middle schooler, I felt increasingly isolated. I was teased at school for being from a single-parent family and had no friends to speak of. Moreover, my relationship with my father worsened, and I stopped going to his factory entirely. I had no place at school or home. My grades were poor, and my confidence plummeted. No matter what I did, I felt like I couldn't succeed, and a sense of emptiness engulfed me. Gradually, I started skipping school and spent more time at home doing nothing. My father didn't say anything about it. One day, he suddenly asked me, "Would you like to go fishing today?" It was the first time since my childhood that he had invited me to go somewhere. I was surprised, and I responded coldly, "Don't you have work?" But my father just smiled. I took the day off. "It's okay to do that sometimes." I didn't reply, just nodded yes. I wasn't very enthusiastic, but I got into my father's car, and we headed to the sea. The sea on a weekday was quiet, with only the sound of the waves. It was a very magical place. He and I started fishing right away. He baited the hook and handed me the fishing rod. "Come on, give it a try. If you catch something big, we'll have a feast tonight." Following his lead, I took the fishing rod. Having been a shut-in for so long, the fishing rod felt unusually heavy. When I couldn't catch any fish, for a while, he suddenly started swinging his rod vigorously. I couldn't understand what was he doing. He explained to me, "This is how you lure the fish." I see. I tried to imitate him. And then, something tugged on my rod. "Dad, I think I caught something." "Well done. Reel it in slowly." We slowly reeled in the fishing line. We managed to catch a small sardine. Both he and I were overjoyed. "Thanks to you, Dad, we caught a fish." When I said that, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "No, James, you caught this fish." I was moved and continued fishing. We caught several more fishes and enjoyed a wonderful time together. That night, he cooked a lavish meal using the fish we had caught. We had the dinner together in a long time. I felt like I was in a dream. While we were eating, he said to me, "Fishing is a lot like life." "Huh?" I was puzzled by his sudden words. I couldn't understand how fishing was like life. He continued, "Fishing isn't just about holding a rod. You need to try different techniques to catch fish. Life is the same. You can't just wait around. You have to go out and seize opportunities. Otherwise, life won't change." His words were powerful. So that's what it meant. For the first time, I realized that I had been going about things the wrong way. "Do you think it's not too late for me?" When I asked, he smiled softly. "You're still in middle school. Your life is just beginning. You can build the life you dream of, from here on out." Hearing his words, I decided to give my all and not give up on my life. Seeing my determination, he looked pleased. From the next day, I started going back to middle school. Some kids teased me for being back, but I decided to ignore them. I didn't need mean people in my life. I was determined to walk the path of the life I wanted, just as my father said. Although it was tough, I gradually improved my grades. When I felt lonely because my father came home late, I started visiting his factory. He began teaching me about his work and showing me what he did. Those times became precious to me. Just a few months ago, I had given up on everything, but I've changed gradually and he seemed happy to see my change. I took it for granted that this happy life with my father would continue. But then, a storm-like event occurred. It happened in the summer of my third year of middle school. Just a few days before summer break ended. When we were having lunch together, Dad suddenly clutched his chest and started to suffer. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked, and he weakly replied, "It's okay. Don't worry." But he looked in severe pain. I quickly called an ambulance. Meanwhile, his complexion was worsening. What if something happens to Dad? That thought dominated my mind. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and he was rushed to a large hospital. What if he has a serious illness? When that thought began to cross my mind, I was called in by the doctor and was stunned. With a look of difficulty, the doctor told me his diagnosis. I was worried because Tom hadn't come to the hospital recently. Tom has progressive cancer. I couldn't believe what the doctor was saying. He didn't tell me anything about this. There must be some mistake. When I said that, the doctor shook his head. He is already in the terminal stage. He probably couldn't bring himself to tell you, James. I collapsed to my knees. The doctor explained many things, but I couldn't hear any of it. I headed to the hospital room where my father was lying. I looked at his face. He seemed to have woken up and was looking at me anxiously. "So you heard my diagnosis?" "I don't have much time left." Holding his hand, I said, "Dad, what am I supposed to do without you?" I was emotional. He stroked my head and said, "I'm still here, and I want to see you graduate middle school. So don't worry too much." His words were weak, but I desperately wanted him to live longer. After that, he was discharged from the hospital. We returned to our usual routine. I started to cherish the time with him, staying by his side whenever I wasn't at school. One day, as my middle school graduation approached, I made a big decision. I decided not to go to high school and instead take over his factory. "We have enough money for you to go to high school," he said, but my mind was made up. His factory dealt with precision machinery, requiring specialized knowledge. I wanted to learn everything from him while he was still alive. Eventually, he agreed with my plan and started teaching me the ropes at the factory every day. He told me he was independently developing medical devices in his spare time. "Why are you developing medical devices? It's expensive and not very profitable, right?" When I asked, he looked serious and said, "If this device succeeds, it will save many lives. If it had been completed a bit earlier, it might have saved your mother." I was speechless. He was developing this medical device for my late mother. He was determined to complete it, but the development was incredibly challenging. And it seemed it would take decades if only done in his spare time. Since he started teaching me, his health had been stable, and I hoped he would continue to live. But the inevitable day was drawing closer. After teaching me everything, he collapsed again in the factory. His face was pale, and he was barely breathing. I quickly called an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctor's expression was grim. I realized that his time was short. I stayed by his side, never leaving him. That night, my father opened his eyes slightly and spoke to me. His voice was faint. "James, I'm sorry I couldn't always be there for you. But you'll be okay on your own now. Stay strong." With those words, he passed away. I was overwhelmed with sadness and couldn't stop crying. At that moment, the factory's only employee, George, rushed to the hospital. George had been working with my father since the factory was founded and was like family to us. He hugged me without saying a word and said, "Come live with me." After that, I don't remember much. The shock was too great, and those memories were wiped from my mind. George handled all the funeral arrangements, and my father was peacefully sent off to heaven. For a while, I couldn't do anything due to the overwhelming loneliness of my father's absence. During this time, George said to me, "This factory that Tom left you, James, you have to protect it." His words brought me back to reality. My father had taught me everything about the factory before he passed away. He must have wanted me to keep the factory running. I resolved to dedicate myself to the factory. But running the factory wasn't easy. When the clients heard about my father's death, they began withdrawing their business. Faced with reality, I was at a loss. At this rate, I wouldn't even be able to pay George, who was also taking care of me. Despite the situation, George didn't leave the factory. "Keep working hard, and the clients will return. This is a time for patience." George said this and continued working tirelessly. For George and my late father, I decided to work even harder. With this resolve, I started looking for new clients. One day, I unexpectedly ran into someone. As usual, I was walking around town, promoting the precision machinery from our factory. Suddenly, I heard a voice from behind. "Hey! Isn't that James?" I turned around fearfully and saw Mark, wearing a prestigious high school uniform. I was shocked and couldn't stop trembling. "Hi. Long time no see," I managed to say, but he looked me up and down, laughing mockingly. Running into him in such a place, I really had no luck. He was the person who had relentlessly bullied me during middle school. I'll never forget that winter in the first year of middle school. He made fun of the hand-me-down coat I was wearing from a neighbor. "That's so lame. Whose hand-me-down is that ugly coat?" Filled with anger at being mocked, I couldn't help but retort, "Shut up. It's none of your business." I regretted it immediately, but controlling my emotions was very difficult. Then, witnessing this, Sarah stood up for me. "Mark, stop being so mean." Sarah, the class Madonna, said this with an angry expression. Shocked by her words, he said nothing more at that moment, but his behavior worsened afterwards. Without Sarah around, he became even crueler to me, making school unbearable. I stopped attending school for a while because of him. Graduating middle school, I thought I was finally free from Mark, but seeing him again felt like a nightmare. He looked down on me just like he used to. "I heard you're working now, because you don't go to high school." Poor guy. Your father didn't leave you anything, huh? Although I was enraged, I knew the best thing to do was to ignore him, so I started to walk away. But he followed me, saying something unexpected. "What? You're ignoring me? Someone like you has no right to ignore me. Who does he think he is? Why do I have to endure this?" My pent-up anger took over. But I refused to give in. I knew that responding would only make things worse, so I kept walking. Gradually, he disappeared from my view. After that, I never saw him again. Time passed quickly, and 20 years went by. I was now 36 years old. Thanks to my sales efforts back then, our factory had transformed into a large operation with many clients. We now have over 200 employees and run a new factory. All of this was possible because of the skills my father left me and George's support. Without the two of them, we wouldn't have grown this much. "Mr. Johnson, it's time for the meeting. We need to get ready quickly, or we'll be late." George was still active and always supported my laid-back approach. "Please don't call me Mr. Johnson. It's embarrassing. We don't have time for that. Hurry up." With his urging, I began preparing to meet our client. "This deal involves millions of dollars. Do your best." George saw me off as I left the factory. I was headed to M Industries. M Industries is the leading company in the precision machinery parts industry. We plan to use their parts to manufacture a new machine soon. I entered the headquarters of M Industries. As I approached the reception, I saw a familiar face. I gasped. It was Mark. Why do I keep running into him in such places? I cursed my bad luck. Looking down, I hoped he wouldn't notice me, but unfortunately, Mark approached me. "What are you doing at my company?" "What? My company?" I never expected him to be working here. Had I walked into the enemy's territory? As I pondered this, he looked down on me again. This isn't a place for a middle school graduate like you. I'm here for a business meeting. When I said that, he laughed. I bet it's just a small deal. We're not selling our parts to someone like you. My father is a manager here, and I'll make sure he knows. I was speechless. Mark knew nothing about my company. It couldn't be helped. With that thought, I ignored him and went to the reception. Watching this, he kept laughing at me. The receptionist showed me to the meeting room where I waited for the representative, John. Within a few minutes, John entered the room. I explained the products we needed for our factory, and the meeting went smoothly. It's an honor for our parts to be used in your factory, James. We look forward to working with you. John smiled. Thank you for accommodating our requests. After that, John and I chatted about various things. As I was getting ready to leave, the meeting room door burst open. It was the company's manager, Mike. John was wide-eyed, wondering what was going on. Then, Mike abruptly spoke to me. Are you James? You went to the same middle school as my son, Mark, didn't you? Behind Mike, I noticed Mark with a smug smile. Mike was Mark's father. Yes, that's right. When I replied, Mike said something unbelievable. It seems you ignored Mark, huh? You must be pretty important to be ignoring people. Which prestigious college did you graduate from? Seeing him smile, it was clear that Mike had already heard everything from Mark and knew all about me. He was intentionally asking to provoke me. I didn't go to college. I'm a middle school graduate. Upon hearing my words, Mike and Mark started laughing. What? You're a middle school graduate? We won't deal with someone so incompetent. The contract is off. Hearing this, John started to panic. Cancel the contract? It was an unexpected turn of events. I was stunned and couldn't comprehend what was being said. What are you saying? John shouted at Mike, and Mark raised his voice angrily. We don't need to do business with someone like you. Our company will be fine without it. Mike added fuel to the fire with more degrading words. A middle school graduate like you must be an idiot. We can't contract with a company that employs someone like you. Mike's voice echoed down the hallway, and the female employees at the reception were looking on curiously. A middle school graduate is incompetent. That's when I realized the situation I was in. Given how far this had gone, there was no turning back. I took a deep breath. John, noticing my demeanor, continued to be agitated. Mike is wrong. James, please don't take it to heart. Hearing him, Mike and Mark laughed even harder. John, why are you so hung up on doing business with a company that has a dropout? The deal can't be that significant. I made up my mind. Then, I guess this $300 million contract is cancelled. What? $300 million? There's no way. John, flustered, desperately began explaining to the two of them. We had a $300 million deal with Johnson Precision Machinery. And what's more, President Smith personally handled this deal. How will you take responsibility for this? What? Mr. Smith handled it personally. That's impossible. I can't believe this nonsense. At that moment, a man appeared behind Mike. And he shouted at Mike in a voice that seemed almost otherworldly. Everything John said is true. I personally requested the deal with Mr. Johnson. Are you saying a $300 million deal is insignificant? Mr. Smith. Mike nearly collapsed in shock. Mark took a step back. I came to check on the commotion and found this. How dare you treat my client this way? Mr. Smith's face was as red as a demon's. Then he looked at me. Mr. Johnson, I am deeply sorry. I can't find the words to apologize enough. Mr. Smith apologized sincerely to me. Mike, visibly shaken, started stammering excuses. Mr. Johnson is a friend of my son, Mark. That's why I said those things. Since they're friends, it shouldn't be a problem. If I had known he was your client, I would never have acted that way. When did Mark and I become friends? I was disgusted by the blatant lies coming from Mike. Mr. Smith watched this exchange with a puzzled look. Mr. Smith. My father is right. James and I are good friends. If I talk to him, he'll reinstate the contract. Mr. Smith listened, trembling with anger. Enough of your convenient lies. Mr. Johnson, is any of this true? I quietly shook my head. There was no truth in their words. Mark bullied me in middle school, calling me poor. There's no way we could be friends. Mr. Smith glared at the two of them. Mark rushed over to me, looking desperate. What are you talking about? We're friends, right? Let's restore the contract. I sighed in disbelief. Mr. Smith, I'm sorry, but I can't do business with a company that employs people with such low character. Mike and Mark turned pale. Mr. Smith stood there, stunned. But then Mike said something shocking. Mr. Smith, I will find another client to replace Johnson Precision Machinery. Let's just give up on this one. No matter what we say. It's clear we can't restore the contract. Mr. Smith's face went from disbelief to a furious rage. You too. How dare you say such things? Stop this nonsense, ahem. Mr. Smith started coughing from his anger. I approached him, patting his back. Mr. Smith, please calm down. This isn't good for your heart. Ahem. Mike and Mark watched in shock as Mr. Smith coughed. John began to explain to them. Mr. Smith recently had a pacemaker implanted. Please don't get him too excited. The two of them looked surprised, clearly unaware of this. Once Mr. Smith's coughing subsided, he began to reveal the truth they didn't know. Mr. Johnson is not someone you can look down on. He has saved many lives. Saved lives. Silence filled the meeting room. Then John handed Mike some documents from my factory. Mike was speechless as he looked through them. A pacemaker? Mr. Johnson manufactures state-of-the-art pacemakers. He approached us to supply parts for his latest model. Mike and Mark were at a loss for words. Yes, my factory now focuses on developing and manufacturing medical devices. This was the device my father had been developing before he passed away. Driven by the hope that an advanced pacemaker could have saved my mother, my father worked on it until his last moments. I continued his work, carrying on his legacy. If the development of this pacemaker succeeds, it will bring significant revenue to my factory. More importantly, it will become a beacon of hope for many people suffering from heart disease. I continued his work. Working tirelessly with George, I finally completed the pacemaker. I was overjoyed when it was finished. We had it tested thoroughly to ensure there were no issues, and then I began promoting it to hospitals. At first, few hospitals were willing to adopt a pacemaker from an unknown factory, but gradually, it gained acceptance and is now used in many hospitals. We receive thank you letters daily from people around the world who have had our pacemakers implanted. One day, while these developments were ongoing, Mr. Smith of M Industries visited my factory. I recognized his face from business magazines. I wondered why the president of such a large company would visit my factory. Then he spoke words that shocked me. Mr. Johnson, your pacemaker saved my life. Your technology is incredible. Please, let our company produce the parts Johnson Precision Machinery needs. It was unbelievable that the president of the top company in the machinery parts industry would personally pitch to me. But as I listened, I realized Mr. Smith wasn't seeking profit. He wanted to help people like himself who suffer from heart disease. If I were to manufacture pacemakers, I wanted to work with someone who shared my values. So, I accepted Mr. Smith's proposal. Today was the day of that meeting. This is when Mike and Mark, unaware of the situation, appeared. Mr. Smith let out a big sigh. Mr. Johnson has endured many hardships. He understands people's pain more than you do. And you, all you can do is look down on others. We're terribly sorry. Mike apologized and nudged Mark to apologize as well. But then, Mr. Smith said something no one expected. Mr. Johnson, if Mike and his son Mark leave the company, will you reinstate the contract? What? That's too harsh. James, you wouldn't do that, would you? I thought deeply. Mr. Smith was a principled and truly admirable person. We shared the goal of helping people with heart disease. I took a deep breath. Yes, please do. These two are only a source of trouble. They will continue to cause problems if we don't deal with them now. As I said this, Mark exploded with anger. Don't you have any compassion? You just got lucky with a hit product. Don't drag us into this. The room fell silent, and Mike began to yell at Mark. What are you saying? We're on the verge of being fired. With that, Mike suddenly dropped to his knees and began to beg. Mark can be fired, but please let me stay. I'll work harder than ever and make amends to Mr. Johnson. Mark reacted immediately. Dad, that's terrible. You're young. You can find another job. I'm too old for that. That's unfair. This is all because of what you said. Shut up. Just do as I say. The embarrassing argument between father and son began. Mr. Smith and John looked on in disbelief. The pacemakers we make at my factory save many lives. I don't want people like this making our parts. I understand. Mr. Smith stood in front of them. He glared at them and raised his voice. You two are reassigned. You will have nothing to do with the products supplied to Mr. Johnson's factory. As Mr. Smith spoke, the two looked at each other, trembling. Then they collapsed to their knees. The two of them remained speechless and despondent. After that, both of them were reassigned to a regional factory. Mike was demoted to a regular employee, but it seems he has turned over a new leaf and is now working hard. Mark decided to quit. He believed he could easily find a job at a better company than M Industries, but reality was not so kind. Unable to find a permanent job, Mark is now working multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. This is likely the consequence of looking down on others for so long. I hope this experience serves as a good lesson for him. Meanwhile, my factory secured a $300 million contract with M Industries. This allowed us to release our state-of-the-art pacemaker, saving even more lives. On a personal note, I married my middle school classmate, Sarah, whom I had been secretly dating. George was as happy as if it were his own wedding. Life has its ups and downs, but I want to continue becoming someone my Father in heaven would be proud of.